The first frost of winter arrived in the Montana Territory, not as a gentle dusting of sugar, but as a fist of iron. It clenched the muddy ruts of Cottonwood Gulch into jagged stone and stripped the last stubborn leaves from the aspen trees. Inside the small log cabin at the edge of town, the wind found every chink in the daubing, whispering of a long and bitter season to come. Abigail Hollis, 22 years old and 4 months a widow, did not look up from her work. Her needle, steady and sure, moved through the thick leather of a torn saddle skirt. The rhythmic punch and pull was a prayer of its own, a testament to survival in a place that offered little else. The cabin was one room, clean and spare. A rope bed, a cold hearth, and a small table where an oil lamp burned, casting a pool of determined yellow light. The flame was her only companion against the growing dark, a tiny star against the immense, indifferent black of the high country. On a small shelf sat her late husband's Bible and a tintype of her mother, a woman she barely remembered, whose smile was as faded as the Montana sky in August. This small space, built by her husband Thomas with his own hands, was the whole of her world, and the Whitlocks meant to take it from her. Her in-laws owned the town's general store, and, more than that, they owned the town's debts. Martha Whitlock, her mother-in-law, was a woman carved from the same hard granite as the crazy mountains that loomed to the west. Her face was a permanent mask of disapproval, her eyes missing nothing and forgiving less. She had never thought Abigail, a preacher's daughter with no dowry and hands calloused from work instead of soft with leisure, was good enough for her son. Thomas's death from a fever had not softened her. It had only sharpened her contempt. Then there was Silas, Thomas's older brother, where his mother was ice. Silas was a grease fire, all smiling affability that could turn scorching in an instant. He ran the store's ledger, his pen scratching out figures that kept half of Cottonwood Gulch in a state of quiet desperation. People said Silas Whitlock could squeeze a nickel until the buffalo wept. He and his mother were the twin pillars of the town's anxieties, holding up the roof of the chapel with one hand while collecting tithes of fear with the other. Abigail set her all down and rubbed her sore fingers. The saddle belonged to a drover passing through, his pay a few coins and a sack of flour that would have to last. Life was a constant calculation of need versus means. The summer drought had been merciless, leaving the cattle herds thin and the fall harvest meager. Now, with the first breath of a hard winter, the prices at Whitlock's Mercantile had crept up. Salt, beans, ammunition, each day a few cents more, each purchase a small surrender. The whole town was stretched thin as a worn-out blanket, and rumors of the railroad building a spur line through the gulch were the only sparks of hope. A railroad meant jobs, money, a future that was not entirely dependent on the whims of the weather and the mercy of the Whitlocks. It also meant land, and the value of every parcel, every dusty acre, was a subject of fevered speculation. It was this speculation, Abigail knew, that had brought the shadow to her door. Thomas had died suddenly, without a will, in the eyes of the territorial law, and more importantly, in the eyes of Martha and Silas. That meant his property reverted to his next of kin. To them, the cabin, the small plot of land it stood on, was nothing to them in terms of wealth, but it was another piece of Cottonwood Gulch to add to their collection. Reverend Michael Miller had visited her last week, his face a study in pained sympathy. He was a good man, but a timid one, his sermons on strength and conviction seeming to fail him when he stepped down from the pulpit. He had held his hat in his hands, turning it over and over as if the answers were written inside the brim. He had said, "The law is a complicated thing. Abigail, without a written testament." "This was my husband's home," she had replied, her voice quiet but not breaking. "Our home. Martha and Silas feel that, as his family, they are the rightful inheritors." The Reverend had avoided her gaze, looking instead at the neatly swept floorboards. "They contribute a great deal to the church, to the town. It makes it difficult to contest their claims publicly." So, the church's gratitude is for sale, she had thought, but she did not say it. There was no point in making an enemy of the one man in town who at least pretended to be a friend. She had simply nodded, thanked him for his concern, and watched him leave, his shoulders hunched against a wind that was not entirely of nature's making. The town itself was a silent witness. When Abigail walked to the boarding house to deliver a mended shirt or to the granary to trade for feed for her 2 chickens, she felt their eyes, the blacksmith, the stable owner, the wives of ranchers. They saw her, a young widow being circled by vultures, but they turned away. They had their own accounts with Silas, their own fears of his mother's cold wrath. In a place like Cottonwood Gulch, courage was a luxury few could afford. A popular saying drifted through the saloons and stables, a piece of grim frontier wisdom out here. The wind blows harder than the gossip, but it is the gossip that chills you. And the gossip was everywhere. It spoke of the Whitlocks' ambitions, of their quiet buying of land options along the suspected railroad path. And it spoke of another man, a name uttered with a different kind of respect and a different kind of fear. Jack Coulter. He was a man who existed more as a legend than a neighbor. His freight wagons, pulled by teams of 16 mules, were the lifeline of the territory, hauling supplies from the railhead in the east to the mining camps in the west. He owned vast tracts of rangeland, a small silver mine up in the Castle Mountains, and a string of way stations that served his drivers. He was a quiet man, rarely seen in town, but his presence was felt in the goods he shipped and the wages he paid. People said Jack Coulter owned half the frontier. He was the only man in the region whose wealth and influence could rival the Whitlocks, a silent king who seemed to have no interest in the petty squabbles of a town like Cottonwood Gulch. Abigail had seen him once, a tall figure in a dusty coat riding through town, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He had not looked left or right, a man moving through a world he owned but did not seem to be a part of. The wind rattled the window pane, pulling her back to the present. The lamp flickered, and for a moment, the room was plunged into near darkness. She held her breath until the flame steadied, her heart beating a little faster. That small, fragile light was everything. It was warmth. It was the ability to work. It was hope. It was a refusal to be swallowed by the cold and the dark that pressed in from all sides. She picked up her needle again. The torn saddle was a symbol of her own life, a thing of value that had been broken but could be made whole again through patience and skill. Survival first, she thought, a creed she had learned early. Dreaming could come later. A sharp knock on the door made her jump. It was too late for a neighborly call, too early for trouble. She hoped. She smoothed her apron, took a deep breath, and opened the door a crack. Silas Whitlock stood on her step, a lantern in one hand and a piece of paper in the other. He smiled, but the expression did not reach his eyes. They were small and dark, like a prospector's stones, weighing and measuring everything they saw. "Good evening, Abigail," he said, his voice slick as oil. "A cold night to be out." "Silas, what can I do for you?" "Just a family matter. Mother and I have been discussing things. It has been more than 40 days since Thomas's passing. It is time for all things to be settled." He held up the paper. It was a formal letter, filled with legal terms she did not understand, but the intent was clear. It was a demand for her to vacate the property. "You cannot do this," she said, her voice a whisper. "It is already done. The house, the land, it belongs to the family now. Thomas was a good man, but not a practical one. He left no will. The law is the law." His smile widened, a predator's grimace. "This is not the law, Silas. This is greed." He chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Call it what you will. The result is the same. The house is ours. You have until the end of the week." He tried to hand her the paper, but she would not take it. Her hands remained at her sides, clenched into fists. He shrugged, then tucked the paper into the frame of the door. It flapped in the wind, a white flag of surrender she had no intention of raising. He tipped his hat and turned to leave, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. As he walked away, the light from his lantern caught the face of Deputy Ephraim Murdoch, who had been waiting in the shadows a few yards away. The deputy did not look at her. He just stood there, a silent endorsement of the Whitlock's power, his presence making the threat official. Abigail closed the door, her body trembling not from the cold, but from a rage so pure it felt like fire in her veins. She walked back to the table and stood for a long moment, looking at the flickering lamp. The north wind howled, a mournful, lonely sound. But inside her, the fire was growing. They thought because she was poor, because she was a woman, because she was alone, that she would break. They were wrong. She looked at the worn leather in her hands, at the needle and thread that were her livelihood. She would not break. She would mend. She would endure. And she would fight. The Whitlocks might own the town, and Jack Coulter might own the frontier, but her own small life, her own small hope, that belonged to her, and she would not let it be taken without a cost. The end of the week arrived with the finality of a slammed door. 40 days. The period of official mourning was over, and with it, any pretense of family connection the Whitlocks might have felt obligated to display. Abigail had not slept. She had spent the nights mending, her needle a tiny weapon against the encroaching darkness, the small cabin a fortress she knew she could not hold. At dawn, she put on her best dress, a simple gray wool, and walked into town. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Smoke rose from chimneys in straight, unwavering columns, the only sign of life in a town that seemed frozen in place. The mercantile was already open, its windows glowing with a false warmth. Inside, the familiar smell of coffee, cured leather, and bulk spices did nothing to comfort her. Martha Whitlock stood behind the main counter, counting coins from a canvas bag into a wooden till. Silas was nearby, marking entries in a ledger with a sharp, scratching sound that set Abigail's teeth on edge. She waited until her mother-in-law looked up. Martha's eyes, the color of a winter sky, showed no surprise. They showed nothing at all. "I need more time. Martha," Abigail said. Her voice was steady, though her heart beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Time is a currency," the older woman replied, her voice as crisp as the frost on the window pane. "And your account is closed. Thomas is gone. You are no longer a Whitlock. You are a Hollis again. These are the facts." "I have nowhere to go." "That is not our concern. You are young. You can work." "I do work," Abigail countered, a spark of heat rising in her chest. "But this cabin is all I have. It is what Thomas built for me. For us." Silas closed his ledger with a soft thud and strolled over, a sympathetic smile fixed on his face. "Now, Abigail, this is unpleasant for everyone. We want to be fair. But there is the matter of Thomas's debts." "Thomas had no debts," she stated flatly. "He was the most careful man I have ever known." Silas produced a folded paper from his coat pocket. It was a promissory note, filled with his own elegant script, for a substantial sum. At the bottom was a signature that was a cruel, clumsy imitation of her husband's hand. He owed the store for supplies, Silas explained, his tone reasonable. "For the lumber to build the cabin, for seed that never took. A loan to see you both through last winter. It is all here. With his passing, the debt falls due. The cabin is the only collateral." "That is a lie," she said, her voice shaking now with the effort of control. His signature never looked like that. Silas's smile tightened. "Are you a legal expert now?" "A handwriting specialist, Mother and I are prepared to forgive the remainder of the debt in exchange for you vacating the property peacefully. It is a generous offer." "It is theft." The bell above the door jingled, and Reverend Miller entered, blinking in the lamplight. He saw the scene at the counter, the tension thick as molasses, and his face fell into its familiar mask of worried helplessness. "Ah, Abigail, Silas, Martha, a difficult day." "Reverend," Abigail began, turning to him, "you must tell them this is not right." The Reverend cleared his throat, looking from the implacable face of Martha to the smug expression of Silas. "The law!" he stammered, twisting the brim of his hat. "The law must be respected. It is a pillar of our community." Silas draped an arm around the Reverend's shoulders. "Exactly right. Reverend, the law, and we are merely following it. The town must have order." He looked directly at Abigail, and his voice dropped, losing its veneer of friendliness and becoming hard as iron. "The law in this town rests on our scales, Abigail, and you have nothing to put on your side of the balance." Her appeal to the community died before it was born. She looked past them, through the large front window. She saw Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, hurry past, her head down. She saw two ranchers who knew her, who had shared coffee with her and Thomas, suddenly find something interesting to look at in the livery stable across the street. And standing on the boardwalk, leaning against a support post, was Deputy Ephraim Murdoch. He was cleaning his fingernails with the tip of a knife, but his eyes were on the store. He was not a peacekeeper. He was a guard dog, and he knew who held his leash. The fight went out of her, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. There was no help here. This was not a negotiation. It was a sentencing. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the store, past the silent deputy, her back straight, her head held high. She did not give them the satisfaction of seeing her run. Back at the cabin, she moved with a methodical purpose that kept grief at bay. She pulled a small wooden trunk from under the bed. It was not large, but it would have to hold everything that mattered. She did not pack for sentiment. She packed for survival. First, her tailor's shears, heavy and oiled, their steel blades still sharp. They were her trade, her independence. Next, she wrapped the tintype of her mother in a spare chemise. Then came the small, worn hymnal that had belonged to her father. Its cover was soft as doeskin, the pages filled with his spidery annotations. These three things were her inheritance skill, memory, and faith. She added a few items of clothing, her sewing kit, and a small sack of coins that amounted to less than $5. She looked around the small room one last time, at the bed she had shared with her husband, at the hearth where they had warmed themselves against this same wind. She chose not to cry. Tears were a luxury, a release she could not afford. This moment required steel. She had just finished buckling the straps on the trunk when Murdoch appeared at the open door. He was not alone. With him was a lanky, unshaven man she did not recognize. "Time's up, Mrs. Hollis," the deputy said, his voice flat. He and the other man entered without being asked. They picked up the trunk and her small roll of bedding and carried them outside. Setting them down in the frozen mud of the path, they went back inside. She heard a few thumps as they moved the table and chairs. Then Murdoch came out with a document. He pressed a stick of red wax against it, melted it with a match, and stamped it with a heavy brass seal. Leaving a clear impression, he affixed the paper to the lid of her trunk. "This here's a writ of seizure," he explained, though she had not asked. "All property held until the debt to the mercantile is settled. You try to take it, that's stealing." He tapped his billy club against his leather boot, a simple, eloquent threat. Then he closed the cabin door and nailed another notice across it. They left her standing there, next to her few possessions, an exile in her own front yard. The smoke still rose from the chimneys of the town, but now it seemed to be from a foreign country. She stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into her bones, until the numbness in her heart spread to her hands and feet. Her first thought was of shelter. The boarding house was her only option. She left the sealed trunk where it was and walked to the rambling two-story building run by Mrs. Gable. The woman opened the door, her face etched with pity and fear. "I cannot, Abigail," she whispered, "not with the Whitlocks." "I will pay," Abigail said. "I just need one night. I have a little money." She remembered a small debt she still owed for a few nights' stay after Thomas first fell ill. She reached into her pocket, but her fingers brushed against something else. On her shawl was a small silver pin, fashioned like a wild rose, one of the few nice things she owned, a gift from her husband, an emblem of a life that was now over. In a single, fluid motion, she unpinned it. "This will cover what I owed you, and tonight as well, it is worth more than that." "Mrs." Gable hesitated, her eyes on the gleaming silver. Then she nodded, took the pin, and led Abigail inside, showing her to the smallest room at the back of the house. As dusk fell, a heavy freight wagon pulled by a long team of mules rumbled down the main street. The driver, a man with a beard the color of salt and pepper and eyes that had seen 1,000 miles of trail, pulled up near the livery. He climbed down stiffly and saw her small pile of belongings sitting forlornly by the side of the road, the red seal glowing like a wound in the fading light. He saw the notice on the cabin door. He looked around and saw the way people avoided that small stretch of road. He asked the stable boy what had happened, and the boy told him. The teamster walked over to where Abigail was just leaving the boarding house, needing air, needing to think. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. He had a low, gravelly voice. "Pardon my forwardness. I heard what happened, and I heard you've a good hand with leather and thread." Abigail just nodded. "Wary." "My boss, Mr. Coulter, he's always looking for folks with real skill. We tear up a lot of harness on these runs. He pays fair, and he don't care about town gossip. His main ranch is the Three Spur. It's a day's walk north of here. Just follow the creek. Ask for Jack." He nodded again, turned, and climbed back onto his wagon. With a call to his team, the great wagon groaned and began to move, leaving Abigail standing in the dust in the deepening twilight with the first shard of hope she had felt all day. She could not afford a room for a second night, with Mrs. Gable's reluctant permission. She spent the next night in the hayloft of the livery stable, the scent of hay and horses a strange comfort. She'd convinced the stable owner to let her bring her trunk over. As the last light of day streamed through the cracks in the wall, she sat beside it, her fingers tracing the edges of the red wax seal. It was an act of defiance, a symbol of their power over her. She looked at it closely. The impression was of an eagle clutching arrows, the official seal of the Montana Territory. But something was wrong. Her eyes, trained for years to spot a misplaced stitch or a flaw in a piece of leather, saw a detail others would miss. The eagle's left wing was slightly less defined than the right. One of the arrows was bent at an odd angle. She had seen the official county seal on documents before, at her own wedding. It was perfect, crisp, every detail sharp. This one was crude, a forgery. A tremor went through her. It was not fear. It was a jolt of pure, clarifying rage. It was not enough for them to steal her home with a lie. They had to stamp that lie with a false seal of authority, a counterfeit law for their counterfeit claim. This changed everything. They had overplayed their hand. They had created evidence. It was small. It was fragile, but it was real. Her goal was no longer just to survive. She would find work. She would keep her self-respect, and she would find a way to prove what they had done. She looked north, in the direction the teamster had pointed. A day's walk, to a man who owned half the frontier and did not care for town gossip. It was a desperate chance, but it was the only one she had. The long walk would begin at dawn. The world shrank to the narrow ribbon of the wagon road, a frozen gray track winding through an endless expanse of white. Abigail Hollis walked with her head down, her shawl pulled tight against a wind that had teeth. It was a predator. That wind, gnawing at any exposed flesh, stealing the warmth from her very bones. She had left her sealed trunk in the care of the livery stable owner, a man whose pity outweighed his fear of the Whitlocks just enough to grant her that small favor. With her meager savings tucked into a small purse and her tailor's shears wrapped in cloth inside her satchel, she had set out at first light, following the ghost of a creek northward. By midday, the sky, which had been a clear, hard blue, turned the color of lead. The air grew still and heavy, a silence that was more threatening than the wind had been. Then the snow began. not in gentle flakes, but in a hard, driving curtain of white that erased the horizon and muffled the world in a sudden, blinding shroud. The road became a memory, a faint depression in the rapidly deepening snow. She pressed on, driven by a cold resolve that was a match for the storm. To stop was to surrender, to freeze, to become another unmarked grave in the vast, uncaring territory. She heard it before she saw it. A thin, panicked whinny carried on the wind, peering through the swirling snow. She made out a dark shape floundering a few yards off the road. It was a colt, no more than a yearling, who had stumbled into a washout hidden by the fresh snow. It was trapped up to its chest, its legs churning uselessly, its eyes wide with terror. It belonged to no one she could see. It must have been separated from its mother or a larger herd in the storm. Every instinct for self-preservation told her to keep walking. She had no time for another's trouble. Her own survival was a fragile, flickering thing. But she looked at the terrified animal, at its desperate struggle against the earth that was trying to swallow it, and she saw a reflection of herself. She could not leave it. Carefully, she made her way to the edge of the washout, her boots sinking deep into the snow. The colt shied away, snorting in fear. She spoke to it in a low, calm voice, the way her father, the preacher, used to gentle, nervous horses for his parishioners. Easy now, easy there, just a bit of bad luck is all. We have all had our share of that. The sound of her voice seemed to quiet it. She unwound her heavy wool shawl, the one thing that kept the wind from her core. It was a terrible sacrifice, but she did not hesitate. Shaking it out, she managed to loop one end under the colt's neck, creating a makeshift sling. She had no leverage, no strength to pull the animal out on her own, but she could give it something to fight for, a direction for its panic. She braced her feet, leaned back, and pulled, not with the expectation of moving it, but simply to hold the tension. "Come on now," she coaxed, her voice strained. "You have to help. Get your legs under you. Fight for it." The colt seemed to understand. It gave a great heave, its front hooves finding a bit of purchase on the sloped side of the gully. It scrambled, slipped back, then lunged again. Abigail held the shawl tight, her own muscles screaming in protest, the wet wool biting into her cold hands. For a long moment, it was a stalemate, a desperate tableau of two struggling creatures against the storm. Then, with a final, shuddering effort, the colt found its footing and lunged up onto solid ground. It stood there, trembling, covered in snow and mud, but free. It looked at her for a second, then shook its head and trotted unsteadily into the white curtain of the storm, disappearing from sight. Abigail stood, panting, her shawl a sodden, muddy ruin in her hands. She was colder than before, her strength spent, but a small, fierce warmth bloomed in her chest. She had not been defeated. She had faced the indifference of the wild and had pushed back. However small the victory, she wrung out the shawl as best she could, wrapped it back around her shoulders, and continued her walk. An hour later, when she was beginning to believe she would walk until she simply fell and was buried by the snow, a dark line emerged from the white haze. It was a fence, tall and sturdy, its posts made from whole tree trunks. She followed it, her hope a painful ache in her throat, until she reached a massive gate, a heavy wooden sign, its letters carved deep and painted black, hung from the crossbeam. It read simply 3 Spur Ranch, Coulter Holdings. She had made it. As she reached for the gate, 2 men on horseback appeared from inside, their coats buttoned to their chins, rifles resting in scabbards by their saddles. They stopped, blocking her way, their faces hard and questioning. "This is private property, ma'am," the older one said. "What is your business?" "I am looking for work," Abigail said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I was told Mr. Coulter might have need of someone with my skills." The man looked her up and down, taking in her muddy dress and exhausted frame. "What skills might those be?" "I can mend any kind of leather, from a fine saddle to a heavy harness. And I am good with numbers. I can keep accounts. I'm asking for a chance to work for my board and a warm place to sleep." The two men exchanged a look. The younger one was about to speak when a voice came from the direction of the large barn behind them. It was a low voice, calm and without inflection. Yet it carried easily through the wind. "Let her in." The men moved their horses aside. Abigail pushed the heavy gate open and stepped through, pulling it closed behind her. A man was walking toward her from the shadows of the barn. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a presence that seemed to fill the space around him. Snow dusted the collar of his heavy sheepskin coat. As he got closer, she could see a square, determined jaw and eyes the color of slate that seemed to see everything at once. This had to be Jack Coulter. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze as assessing and impersonal as the ranch hands had been, but far more intelligent. He looked at her hands, which were red and raw from the cold and the ordeal with the colt. Then he met her eyes. "The teamster said you were looking for work," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "I am," she replied. "Around here, anyone who can mend a saddle is a person of mine. For a time," he gestured toward the barn. "There is a set of traces in there, snapped clean through by a green team this morning. The storm is getting worse. You will not make it any farther tonight. Fix the traces, and you have a place to sleep and a hot meal." It was a test, not a kindness, but a trial. She nodded, grateful for the clarity of it. He led her into the vast, cavernous barn. The air inside was thick with the scent of hay, horses, and warm animals. It was the most welcoming smell in the world. He pointed to a broken piece of harness hanging from a peg. An awl, waxed thread, and a few scraps of leather sat on a workbench nearby. He did not offer her a chair or a warmer spot. He just watched. She took off her wet shawl and hung it on a hook. Her fingers were stiff and clumsy with cold, but she forced them to work. She examined the break, trimmed the edges clean with her own shears, and selected a piece of scrap leather. She punched the holes with the awl, her movements becoming more sure, more rhythmic as the familiar work took over. The barn was cold, but the focus of the task generated its own heat. She threaded the needle and began to stitch, her head bent low, each stitch placed with perfect, practiced precision. Jack Coulter did not move. He stood leaning against a stall, his arms crossed, observing her with an unnerving stillness. There was no pity in his eyes, only a quiet, intense scrutiny. He was not looking at a desperate woman. He was evaluating a craftsman. When she was finished, she ran her hand over the repair. It was a solid, clean seam, as strong as the original leather. She held it out to him. He took it, turning it over in his hands, testing the stitches with his thumb. He bent the leather, pulled at it. Finally, he gave a single, curt nod. "The work is good," he said. He led her out of the barn and toward the main ranch house, a long, low building of timber and stone from which smoke was pouring. They passed a blacksmith's shop, and, through the open door, she saw the glowing heart of a forge and heard the ringing of a hammer on steel. The sparks that flew up into the dim light seemed like a promise, a sign of something new being made from fire and force. A man came toward them, his face creased with worry. "Tom Baines, the foreman." He nodded at Abigail but spoke to his boss, Jack, word from town. "Silas Whitlock just bought the option on the old Miller place, down by the creek. He is trying to box us in, offering pennies on the dollar to anyone who will sell and making trouble for anyone who will not. That railroad rumor has him acting like a man possessed." Jack's expression did not change. "Let him," he said. "We have clear titles." "Clear titles have not stopped him before," Baines countered. "You know how he operates. He will find a way." "I know," Jack said, and the single phrase held a world of weariness. "I will handle it." Baines nodded and left them. Jack turned to Abigail as if the conversation had never happened. "The terms are these," he said, his voice once again flat and businesslike. "You can stay for 2 weeks. We will see how it goes. You will be paid at the end of each day. Cash or supplies from our store. Your choice. There will be no debts, no running accounts. We will be square every evening. Understood.
Yes, thank you.
He looked at her.
I am not good at saying thank you,
she said, feeling the need to explain. The words felt inadequate for the chance he was giving her. He seemed to consider this for a moment. Around here, people pay their thanks by getting the job done on time. For the first time since her husband had died, she felt a loosening in her chest. It was the feeling of being seen not as a widow, not as a problem, not as a charity case, but as someone with a skill to offer, an equal in a transaction. He saw her chapped and bleeding hands, but he also seemed to see that her eyes, though tired, were not bowed. They reached the main house. He could have shown her to the bunkhouse with the men, or to a cold storage room. Instead, he led her through to the back, to a large, warm kitchen that smelled of roasting meat and baking bread. A large Chinese man with a long, graying braid looked up from a stew pot, his face impassive.
This is Abigail Hollis,
Jack said to the cook. She will be working for us for a while. She can do her mending here, at the corner table. It is warm, and the light is good. The cook, whom Jack called Mr. Lou, simply grunted in acknowledgement. But the gesture was not lost on Abigail. It was a small act of consideration, an unspoken concession to her comfort. It was not kindness, not exactly. It was something more practical, something more valuable. It was respect. He had given her a place to work, a place to start again. Not in a cold and lonely corner, but here, in the warm, beating heart of the ranch. The days at the Three Spur Ranch fell into a rhythm, as steady and comforting as a heartbeat. Life was work, and work was life. A truth Abigail had always known but felt more deeply here. Each morning, she rose before the sun, the air in her small room in the back of the ranch house sharp with cold. She would join the quiet bustle in the kitchen, taking a mug of Mr. Lou's fiercely strong coffee and a piece of bread before settling at her corner table. The pile of broken harness, ripped saddlebags, and worn-out bridles was a constant mountain she was tasked to climb, and she did so with a quiet determination. Her hands, once raw and chapped, toughened. The motions became second nature, the smooth glide of the awl through thick leather, the satisfying pull of the waxed thread as it cinched a seam tight, the scent of the beeswax she heated over a small lamp to waterproof her stitches. The ranch hands, initially reserved and watchful, began to treat her as part of the machinery of the place. They would drop a broken piece of gear on her table with a gruff nod and pick it up later, repaired and strong. With another, no words were needed. The quality of her work was her language. Jack Coulter remained a distant, watchful presence. He was the first to rise and the last to sleep. A man who seemed to be in constant, silent conversation with his vast holdings. She saw him conferring with his foreman, checking the hooves of a new horse with a practiced eye, or poring over freight manifests and ledgers at his large desk in the main room. He was a man of documents and deeds, of tangible proof. Abigail remembered the teamster's words and understood. In a world of shifting alliances and whispered lies, Jack Coulter trusted what was written down, what was weighed and measured, what was signed and accounted for. She heard stories from the men about a payroll wagon that had been robbed years ago, a partner lost in the fight. Since then, Coulter's systems were rigid, his paperwork flawless. He paid his debts on time, and he expected the same from everyone else. He trusted a clean ledger more than a county seal, a bill of lading more than a politician's promise. The only person who seemed to break through his reserve was the cook, Mr. Lou. He had been with Coulter since the beginning, and they shared an easy, unspoken understanding. The cook ruled his kitchen with an iron ladle, and his sharp observations were a source of dry humor in the long days. One afternoon, as Abigail struggled with the temperament of the kitchen's coal stove, Mr. Lou shuffled over. "Do not trust the stove," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It breathes like a bull with a bee in its nose. sometimes hot, sometimes cold. You listen to it, not with your ears, with your hands. He showed her how to gauge the heat by holding her palm a few inches from the cast iron surface. He taught her that everything had a language, if you were patient enough to learn it. That lesson in patience was put to a brutal test one night when a sudden, violent blizzard swept down from the mountains without warning. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the snow fell so thick it was like a solid wall of white. A shepherd had been moving a flock of ewes to a more sheltered pasture when the storm hit, and a section of the flock had been driven in panic toward a deep, narrow ravine at the edge of the property. The call for help came just after the evening meal. A breathless shepherd, his face caked with ice, burst into the main house. They're trapped, maybe a dozen of them, on a ledge just below the rim. The rest of the flock is scattered. Jack was on his feet in an instant, pulling on his heavy coat. Baines, get a crew, ropes, lanterns. Lou, keep hot coffee on the stove. He looked at Abigail. Stay here where it is warm? No, she said, the word out of her mouth before she could think. I can help. I can handle animals. He looked at her for a long second, his slate-gray eyes seeming to weigh her resolve. Then he gave a short nod. Get a coat from the back peg. The scene at the ravine was a nightmare of wind, snow, and panicked bleeding. Lantern light cut shifting, ghostly holes in the darkness, revealing the terrified sheep huddled on a narrow shelf of rock about 15 feet down. The snow was making the ledge treacherous, and the drop below was a fatal one. Jack organized the rescue with a calm, efficient authority. They hammered iron pickets into the frozen ground to anchor the ropes. There was no way to climb down. The only chance was to loop the sheep one by one and haul them up. It was slow, dangerous work. The wind tore at them, and the snow was so blinding it was hard to tell where the edge of the ravine even was. They had managed to get 3 of the animals up when a section of the ledge, heavy with snow, gave way. One of the ewes, already roped, slid toward the abyss, its weight suddenly dead on the line. Jack and another man were holding the rope, and the sudden jerk pulled them toward the edge. Jack shouted, "Let her go!" But the other man, his feet slipping in the snow, could not release his grip. Without thinking, Abigail lunged forward and grabbed the rope behind Jack, digging her heels in, adding her small weight to the struggle. The rough hemp tore at her hands, but she held on, for a terrifying moment. All 3 of them were sliding, inches from disaster. Jack managed to kick a boot into a frozen clump of sagebrush, arresting their slide. He turned, his face a hard mask in the lantern light, and with a grunt of effort, heaved the other man back from the edge. As he did, the taut rope snapped across his arm, and he let out a sharp, involuntary hiss of pain. They managed to haul the dangling ewe to safety, and then they all collapsed, panting, in the snow. The rest of the rescue passed in a blur of cold and exhaustion. By the time the last sheep was safe, the storm had begun to break, and the first hints of a bruised purple dawn were appearing in the east. They stumbled back to the ranch house, a weary, silent group. In the kitchen, Mr. Lou had hot stew and coffee waiting. As Jack shrugged off his heavy coat, Abigail saw the dark stain of blood on his shirt sleeve. "Your arm," she said. "Let me see it." "It is nothing," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "It is not nothing. It needs to be cleaned." She went to the dry sink and came back with a basin of warm water and a clean cloth from a basket of kitchen towels. She gently pushed up his sleeve. The rope had torn through the fabric and gouged a deep, raw furrow in his forearm. The wound was full of dirt and grime. She cleaned it carefully, her touch surprisingly gentle for someone whose hands were so calloused. He sat stiffly at the table, watching her, his jaw set. As she finished wrapping the wound with a strip of clean linen, she saw it a pale, jagged scar that circled his wrist like a bracelet. It was an old wound, long healed, but it spoke of a past violence, a story of pain and survival that he carried with him every day. It was, she thought, the price of owning half the frontier. When she was done, she looked up and met his eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. "You were a help tonight." She just nodded, her throat suddenly tight. Later that day, her courage bolstered by the shared ordeal, she found him alone in the main room, studying a map. "Mr. Coulter," she began, "I need to tell you something." She explained what had happened to her in Cottonwood Gulch, about the false debt and the eviction, and then she took out a small piece of scrap leather from her apron pocket. On it, she had painstakingly recreated the flawed eagle from the wax seal on her trunk, sketching it over and over from memory until it was perfect. "I have seen this before," he said, his voice flat, but with an undercurrent of something she could not name. "It was 3 years ago, a dispute over a mining claim near the Judith Basin. The documents looked official, but the seal was a forgery, same as this one. A bad copy. A man lost his claim because of it." "So I am not wrong," she whispered. "No," he said, his eyes still on her drawing. "You are not wrong." A few days later, a small group of children, their face pinched with cold and their clothes patched and worn, appeared at the edge of the ranch yard. They were from the shanties a few miles down the creek, where the families of miners and seasonal laborers lived. They had come to beg for scraps of leather to repair their shoes or to use as cord. Abigail saw them from the kitchen window. Instead of sending them to the scrap pile, she went out to meet them. She brought a bundle of leather strips, too thin for harness but still strong. She sat with them on the steps of the bunkhouse, the cold forgotten, and showed them how to cut the leather into even thinner strips and braid them into strong, supple laces and cordage. She taught them a skill, something they could use, something that was theirs. It was a small act, but it felt important, like planting a seed in frozen ground. Her 2 weeks were nearly up when the sound of an approaching horse brought her to the door of the ranch house. It was Deputy Ephraim Murdoch. He rode into the yard as if he owned it, his face set in a smug, confident expression. He dismounted and strode toward her, a piece of paper in his hand. "Hollis," he said, "dispensing with any courtesy, I have a writ here for the seizure of your personal property and any wages earned, to be applied to your outstanding debt to the Whitlock Mercantile." Before she could respond, Jack Coulter stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He moved with a deceptive slowness, his calm a stark contrast to the deputy's aggressive posture. "You are on private land, Murdoch," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a distinct chill. "I have official business, Coulter, a legal writ." He held out the paper. Jack took it. He did not read it. His eyes went straight to the bottom, to the clumsy red seal she knew so well. He looked from the seal to Murdoch's face, a flicker of profound contempt in his eyes, and then, with a quiet deliberation, he tore the document in half. The sound of the ripping paper was as loud as a gunshot in the still, cold air. He let the 2 pieces of paper fall to the ground. "Get off my land," he said, "and when you come back, you bring a real judge with you." Murdoch stared at the torn paper, his face a mixture of shock and fury. His hand drifted toward the pistol on his hip, but he seemed to think better of it. He looked at Jack's unmoving form, at the hard-faced ranch hands who had stopped their work and were now watching, and he made his decision. Without another word, he snatched the pieces of his worthless writ from the ground, mounted his horse, and rode away, a cloud of dust his only parting shot. Abigail stood on the porch, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had watched power crumble in the face of quiet, unyielding integrity, the fear that had been her constant companion since she had walked out of the Mercantile. The feeling of being small and helpless against the weight of the town's laws and prejudices began to recede. In its place, something new and hard was beginning to form. It was not hope, not yet. It was resolve, a foundation of stone upon which, she knew, a new life could be built. The 2 weeks of Abigail's trial period melted into a month, the unspoken agreement solidifying into fact. She was no longer a temporary stray. but a part of the Three Spurs ecosystem, as essential as the blacksmith's hammer or the cook's ladle. When Jack rode into Cottonwood Gulch for supplies, she rode with him, sitting straight-backed on the wagon seat, a ledger of needed items in her lap. The town that had cast her out now watched her with a mixture of resentment and grudging respect. She was with Coulter. That changed the arithmetic of her existence entirely. It was on one of these trips that she began to see the threads of a community that existed outside the Whitlock's web. She met Ruthie, the blacksmith, a woman with arms as thick as wagon axles and a tongue as sharp as newly forged steel. Ruthie was hammering a glowing horseshoe into shape, her face streaked with soot and sweat. She squinted at Jack. "So, you finally hired someone who can count past 20 without taking off their boots. About time." She winked at Abigail. "Do not let his quiet fool you. Honey, he is rich as the railroad, but he eats porridge like a private in the army. Thinks a dollar saved is a dollar he does not have to fight someone for later." They met Mary Ellen Pike, the town's new schoolteacher. She was a woman with a gentle face but a firm, determined chin, who was trying to teach reading and arithmetic in a converted saloon. She spoke to Abigail with an immediate warmth, an unspoken kinship between two women trying to build something of their own in a world built by and for men. And they met Dr. Avery, who kept an office smelling of whiskey and carbolic acid. He was a man whose hands, though they sometimes trembled, were said to be the steadiest in the territory when it came to setting a bone or stitching a wound. He looked at Abigail with sad, knowing eyes, the eyes of a man who had seen too much of the frontier's casual cruelty. He was a constant presence in the town saloon, a man drowning his own ghosts in cheap liquor. This was the world Jack Coulter inhabited, a network of pragmatic, hard-working people who respected skill and valued a square deal. It was a world Abigail was beginning to realize she wanted to be a part of. The question was no longer simply who she belonged to, but where she belonged. The answer began to form during the fall cattle drive. A sizable herd had to be moved to the winter pastures in the low hills, a 3-day journey across open country. It was a time of heightened risk. A band of rustlers, known as the Nighthawks, had been hitting ranches in the area, and a Coulter herd was a tempting prize. Jack made his preparations with his usual quiet intensity. Guards were assigned to ride the flanks and the drag, their rifles cleaned and ready. Abigail's role was to stay with the chuck wagon, managed by the grumbling but capable Mr. Lou. Her job was to be the field surgeon for the endless stream of gear that would inevitably break under the strain. The first 2 days were long and dusty, but uneventful. It was on the second night that the tension thickened. The cattle were bedded down in a wide, grassy basin, restless under a sliver of a moon. The Nighthawks were known to strike in the dark, using the noise of a storm or the dead of night to create a stampede. After the evening meal, as the men settled into their watch rotations, a nervous energy hung around the campfire. Jack moved through the camp, his presence a quiet reassurance. He stopped by the chuck wagon, where Abigail was working by lantern light, stitching a tear in a thick leather stirrup strap. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot simmering on the fire. "You should get some sleep," he said. "I will sleep when this is done," she replied, not looking up. A rider with a broken strap is a rider on the ground. He stood there for a moment, watching the sure, efficient movement of her hands. The vast, star-dusted canopy of the Montana sky stretched above them, a dome of silent, glittering diamonds. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, a sound as old as time itself, carrying the scent of dust and wild herbs. "A man who owns half the frontier," she said softly, more to herself than to him, "must not get much sleep." He was quiet for so long she thought he had not heard her. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, stripped of its usual businesslike tone. "A man who owns half the frontier is not rich because he is smart. He is rich because he buried the other half of his friends out here." He looked out into the darkness, toward the unseen mountains. "This land takes a price for everything it gives you. I started with a partner and a single freight wagon. He is buried in a pass up near the divide. The Nighthawks got him for a payroll that was not even worth $1,000. She finally looked up, her needle still in his eyes. She saw the ghost of that loss, a sorrow so deep it had become a part of the landscape of his face. It was the bedrock of his caution, the reason for his ledgers and his solitude. She found herself asking a question that was both bold and necessary. "Is your money clean, Mr. Coulter?" He met her gaze, and there was no offense in his eyes, only a weary understanding. "The ledgers are clean, Abigail. My hands are dirty from the work that filled them." The next afternoon, during a quiet stretch of the drive, he found her watching the riders practice their aim on discarded cans. He walked over, a pistol in his hand. "You need to learn," he said simply. "I do not like them," she said. "The noise. Being afraid of the noise is what gets people hurt in a fight. They freeze. You do not have to like it. You just have to not be afraid of it." He opened the chamber to show her it was loaded with blanks. Cartridges with powder, but no bullet. "For the noise," he said. He showed her how to hold it, how to stand, how to brace her arm. His touch was impersonal, instructive, yet there was an undeniable connection in the act of him positioning her hands, of standing close enough for her to feel the quiet certainty of his presence. "Just squeeze," he said. "Do not jerk." She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening, a violent crack that made her flinch, but she held on. She opened her eyes. He was watching her face, not the target. "Again," he said. She fired again and again, until the recoil was no longer a shock, and the noise was just a noise. When the chamber was empty, he took the pistol back. "Thank you," she said, her ears ringing. He nodded. "Do not be in debt to fear." She managed a small smile. "I hate to be in debt," she said, even for a bit of courage. That night, a rider came into the camp, a former Whitlock teamster who now worked a small claim up in the hills. He was a nervous, shifty man, and he asked to speak to Coulter alone. Abigail, packing away her tools, could not help but overhear their low conversation near the wagon. "I hear you and the Whitlocks ain't on the best of terms," the man said, his voice greasy with conspiracy. "We do our business separately," Jack replied, his voice noncommittal. "Well, for a price, I could help you in yours. I know their routes, I know their schedules. I even got my hands on a few of these." He produced a folded paper. It was a blank seizure form, already stamped with the same clumsy, forged seal that had been on her trunk. They print 'em up ahead of time. See for folks who get behind on their accounts. Saves 'em a trip to the county seat. "How much?" Jack asked, his voice dangerously soft. The man named a price. Jack was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Get out of my camp." "What? But I thought—" "I do not buy stolen goods, and I do not buy counterfeit laws. Now get out." The man scurried away into the darkness, leaving behind the undeniable proof of a wider conspiracy. It was not just Abigail. The Whitlocks had a system for their theft, a production line of false documents to enforce their will. The rest of the drive passed without an incident from the Nighthawks, and they returned to the ranch under a clear, cold sky. The following week, on another trip to town, Abigail and Jack stopped at Dr. Avery's office to deliver a payment for his treatment of an injured ranch hand. The doctor was in his usual state of afternoon melancholy, a glass of amber liquid on his desk. As they were leaving, Deputy Murdoch walked down the street on the opposite side, his chest puffed out with self-importance. Dr. Avery let out a small, bitter laugh. "There goes the law," he muttered. "Bought and paid for." He took a sip from his glass. "I saw him, Murdoch, a month or so back, down by the stagecoach depot. He was buying something from a fancy-looking fella, a stranger in a derby hat, a little brass thing. Thought it was odd. A deputy of the law, doing business in the shadows." He looked from Jack to Abigail, his sad eyes suddenly sharp with understanding. It was a seal, wasn't it? That is what the stranger sold him, a brand for his master's cattle. The first heavy snows melted under the surprising warmth of a Chinook wind, and the land, for a brief time, breathed a sigh of muddy relief to celebrate the successful cattle drive and the coming end of a long year. Jack Coulter announced a barn dance. The entire community was invited, a rare occasion for the scattered, hard-working people of the territory to gather under one roof. The great barn at the Three Spur was swept clean, and long tables were set up for a feast prepared by Mr. Lou. Lanterns were hung from the rafters, casting a warm, flickering glow that softened the hard edges of the world. From the kitchen door, Abigail watched the guests arrive, ranchers and their wives, miners with scrubbed faces, the blacksmith Ruthie in a clean dress that looked foreign on her powerful frame, and even the schoolteacher Mary Ellen Pike, who arrived with a small group of her older students. A fiddler struck up a lively tune, and the sound of laughter and stamping feet filled the cavernous space. It was a world away from the cold, silent judgment of Cottonwood Gulch. Here, a person was measured by the strength of their handshake and the honesty of their word. Abigail felt a sense of belonging that was both new and terrifying. She had found a port in a storm, but she was not yet sure if she was a part of the ship or merely a piece of cargo. She stayed in the background, helping Mr. Lou serve food, content to be an observer. She saw Jack moving through the crowd, a quiet, solid presence. He was not a natural host. He spoke little, but he listened with an intensity that made people feel heard. He was respected. That much was clear. But he was also separate, a man who owned the stage but did not seem to enjoy the play. Later in the evening, he made his way over to her. The fiddler was playing a slow waltz, and a few couples were circling the floor. He nodded toward the dancers.
You should be out there.
I am a better seamstress than a dancer, she said with a small smile. He looked at the dancers, then back at her. Me too, he admitted. But it seems to be expected. He held out a hand. It was not a gesture of romance, but of duty, a formal, slightly awkward invitation. She hesitated for only a moment before placing her hand in his. His grip was firm and calloused, the hand of a man who worked. They walked onto the floor, and he placed a hand on her waist, his touch light and uncertain. They moved together in a clumsy, shuffling circle, out of step with the music and with each other. A few of the ranch hands grinned, but no one laughed. It was a rare sight, their quiet, solitary boss attempting a social grace, and they afforded him their respect. After a few awkward turns, they began to find a rhythm, a simple back-and-forth step that was less a dance and more a shared, deliberate walk. They did not speak. In the small space between them, the unspoken history of the past month hung in the air, the rescue in the snow, the confrontation with Murdoch, the long nights on the trail. As the song ended, they stood for a moment in the middle of the floor. Ruthie the blacksmith, holding a mug of cider, called out, "You two look about as comfortable as a bear in a bathtub." The crowd laughed. A warm, friendly sound. A blush rose on Abigail's cheeks, but she found herself smiling, on an impulse, feeling a surprising surge of confidence from the warmth of the room and the shared moment. She looked up at Jack and spoke, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden lull. "Banished by her in-laws," she quipped, her eyes twinkling. She found freedom in the arms of a man who owned half the frontier. A great roar of laughter and applause went up from the crowd. It was the perfect frontier joke, a headline for a story they had all been watching unfold. It was witty, a little tragic, and it poked fun at the very man who was their host. Abigail's hand flew to her mouth, suddenly horrified by her own boldness. She looked at Jack. A deep frown had creased his brow, and his jaw was tight. For a terrible second, she thought she'd gone too far, had mistaken his tolerance for friendship. But then the corners of his mouth twitched. The frown dissolved, and a slow, reluctant smile spread across his face. It was the first real smile she had ever seen from him, and it transformed his severe features, making him look younger, less burdened. He did not say a word. But his eyes met hers, and in that shared look, an acknowledgment passed between them. A bond, once unspoken, had been brought into the light and named. The next day, the weather turned. The Chinook vanished, and the wind swung back to the north, carrying with it a haze of dust from the dry plains to the east. By afternoon, the sky was a sickly yellow, and a fierce, scouring wind began to blow, picking up loose soil and turning the air into a gritty, blinding fog, a dust storm. Abigail had been in the paddock helping to mend a fence when it hit. The world disappeared in an instant. She could not see the barn, could not see the house. The wind was a physical force, pushing her, the stinging dust filling her eyes, her nose, her mouth. She heard Jack shouting her name, his voice distorted by the gale. She saw his shape appear out of the brown gloom. "The smokehouse," he yelled over the roar. "It is closest." He grabbed her hand, and they stumbled together through the maelstrom, their heads down, their eyes squinted shut. The smokehouse was a small, windowless structure of thick timber, built to be airtight. Jack shoved the heavy door open, pushed her inside, and then threw his weight against it to close it again. Suddenly, they were in a world of absolute silence and near-perfect darkness. The roar of the wind was gone, replaced by a muffled, distant howl. The only light was a single, thin line under the door. The air was cool and thick with the lingering, pleasant scent of hickory smoke. Abigail leaned against the wall, her heart pounding, her body trembling from the cold and the sudden shock. She coughed, trying to clear the dust from her lungs. "You are shaking," he said, his voice a low sound in the enclosed space. "It is the cold," she said, though it was not entirely true. She heard him moving, the scuff of his boots on the dirt floor. Then she felt the heavy weight of his sheepskin coat being draped over her shoulders. The wool was warm from his body, and it smelled of leather, sage, and him. The trembling began to subside. They stood in the silence, not touching, but acutely aware of each other's presence in the small, dark room. The world outside had ceased to exist. There was only the darkness, the scent of smoke, and the sound of their own breathing. She could hear the steady rhythm of his breath, a calm counterpoint to the frantic beating of her own heart. He moved to the door and peered through a small knothole. "It will be a while," he said. "These can last for hours." She pulled his coat tighter around her. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "For the coat, for everything." He turned from the door, his shape a dark silhouette against the faint light. "Your freedom is your own." "Abigail," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "It is not a gift from me. You earned it. You are not a guest here. You are a partner in this work." His words settled deep inside her, a weight and a liberation all at once. Partner. He had given her a title, a place, a definition that was not tied to any man but to her own skill and her own will. In that moment, she made her choice. She was not just passing through. She would stay. She would fight for her name, for her home. But her life was no longer on hold, waiting for that fight to be over. Her life was here, now. She started to say something, but the words caught in her throat. She felt him move closer. A hand reached out in the darkness and found hers. Not to hold it, but just a brief, reassuring touch of his fingertips against her own. A current passed between them, a spark of understanding that needed no light to be seen. When the wind finally died down hours later, they stepped out into a world transformed. A thick layer of brown dust covered everything, softening the landscape like a fresh fall of snow. The air was still and cool. They walked back to the ranch house in silence, but it was a different silence than before. It was no longer the silence of two strangers, but the comfortable quiet of two people who had shared something important. The next morning, as Abigail was in the main room helping Jack sort through a stack of freight invoices, Deputy Murdoch returned. He did not come alone this time. He had two grim-faced men with him, strangers with hard eyes. "Coulter," Murdoch said, his voice straining for authority. "I have a warrant from the circuit judge to search these premises for assets belonging to Abigail Hollis, in lieu of payment of her debts." Jack did not even look up from his papers. He simply nodded toward the large, leather-bound ledger on the table in front of Abigail. "You can look at the books," he said. Murdoch and his men stepped forward, but instead of handing the ledger to the deputy, Jack looked at Abigail. "Your accounts," he said. "You handle it." It was a profound gesture of trust. He was placing the symbol of his entire enterprise, his clean and perfect books, into her hands, and letting her be the one to face down their shared enemy. A current of strength shot through her. She was no longer the frightened widow. She was a partner. She stood up, placing a protective hand on the ledger. She looked Murdoch directly in the eye, her expression calm and unreadable. "The books are in order." "Deputy," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But this ledger can read, sir. Can you?" A flicker of stunned anger crossed Murdoch's face. The insult, delivered with such polite, razor-sharp precision, had hit its mark. He was a bully and a thug, a man who understood force but was confounded by wit. He began to stammer a reply, but he was interrupted by the sound of a horse riding hard into the yard. A moment later, Mary Ellen Pike burst into the room, her face pale, a folded piece of paper clutched in her hand. "Jack, Abigail," she said, breathless. "I'm sorry to interrupt. This was pushed under my door last night. I think you need to see it." She handed the paper to Jack. It was a single sheet of cheap paper, the words written in a rough, anonymous block script. Jack read it, his face hardening into a mask of cold fury. He handed it to Abigail. The note was short. "The railroad syndicate meets with the county commissioners in 2 weeks. No clean titles in Cottonwood Gulch. No spur line. They will route through the Northern Valley instead." Suddenly, everything became terrifyingly clear. The Whitlocks' frantic land grab, the forged documents, the pressure on anyone who stood in their way. It was not just about petty greed. It was about cornering the market on all the land the railroad would need, ensuring that they were the only ones with clean titles to sell when the syndicate came to buy, and anyone with a disputed claim, like Abigail, was a threat to their entire scheme. They had a deadline, and now, so did she. They had to prove the Whitlocks' fraud before that meeting, or the fate of the entire town would be sealed. The anonymous note lay on the table, a declaration of war written on a scrap of paper. Murdoch and his men, forgotten for a moment, shuffled their feet, the legal authority of their warrant dissolving in the face of a much larger, more urgent crisis. Jack Coulter did not waste time on anger. His face became a study in cold calculation. He looked at Murdoch. "The meeting is in 2 weeks. That is your deadline as well as ours. Now get out of my house." There was no room for argument in his voice. The deputy, clearly out of his depth and sensing the shift in power, herded his men out the door without another word. As soon as they were gone, Jack turned to Abigail and Mary Ellen. "We need proof," he said, his voice clipped and precise. "Not just a flawed seal, but the source of it." Dr. Avery saw Murdoch buy a seal from a stranger at the stagecoach depot. "What route does the stage take before it gets to Cottonwood?" "It comes over Snowbridge Pass," Mary Ellen answered, her voice trembling slightly. Jack nodded, his eyes already distant. Running through possibilities. That is high country, isolated. A good place for a man to set up a workshop no one will stumble upon. He looked at Abigail. Then he walked to the door and bellowed a name. "Ruthie." The blacksmith appeared a few minutes later, wiping her hands on an oily rag. Jack explained the situation quickly, without embellishment. The forged seals, the railroad, the 2-week deadline. "I need your eyes," he told her. "You know metal. You know the tools that work it. Abigail, you know detail work. The 3 of us will ride up to the pass at first light. We are not looking for a man. We are looking for his mistakes." The ride to Snowbridge Pass was a grim, silent affair. They climbed out of the relative shelter of the valley and into the high, wind-swept country where the trees grew sparse and stunted. The air was thin and bitingly cold. Ruthie, on her sturdy mountain horse, proved to be an expert tracker, pointing out faint signs of a shod horse leaving the main trail, a broken branch that was not the work of the wind. They found the camp in a small, hidden bowl of rock, sheltered from the prevailing wind. It was deserted, but the signs of recent occupation were everywhere. A cold fire pit, a discarded tin can, and, on a flat-topped boulder that had served as a workbench, a few slivers of brass and the faint, scarred outline of an eagle's wing. "He was working right here," Ruthie said, running a calloused finger over the scarred rock. "Got a set of engraver's tools. Looks like not a master craftsman. See here, the lines are too deep. He used too much pressure. In a hurry." Abigail knelt and sifted through the ashes of the fire pit. Her fingers found something hard. She pulled it out. It was a piece of partially burned paper, a practice sheet. On it were several impressions of the flawed seal, some clear, some smudged. The forger had been perfecting his work. He had left his mistakes behind. It was corroboration, but it was not the man himself. He had packed up and vanished. They returned to Cottonwood Gulch as dusk was falling, a sense of frustrated urgency hanging over them. They had proof, but not a witness who could tie it to Murdoch and the Whitlocks. As they dismounted in front of the livery stable, a young boy with a smudge of blacking on his cheek and a wooden shoeshine box slung over his shoulder approached them. "Shine your boots." "Mr. Coulter." Jack, preoccupied, was about to wave him away when Abigail put a hand on his arm. She knelt down to the boy's level. "We are looking for someone," she said kindly. "A stranger who was in town a month or so back. A man in a derby hat. He might have been doing business down by the stage depot." The boy's face lit up with the self-importance of a keeper of secrets. "Yeah, I seen him. Fella with shifty eyes. Stayed at the boarding house for a couple of days. He paid me a whole $1 just to carry a small, heavy bag for him." "Do you know his name?" Jack asked, his voice suddenly sharp with focus. The boy puffed out his chest. "Sure do. Heard him talking to Deputy Murdoch. Name's Pike. Jasper Pike." The name landed in the cold air like a stone. Abigail and Jack both turned to look at Mary Ellen, whose face had gone as white as the snow on the distant peaks. "Pike," she whispered, her voice a thread of disbelief. "Jasper. My brother, no, it cannot be. Jasper he is a dreamer. He gets into trouble, but not like this, not this." She swayed on her feet, and Abigail rushed to support her, wrapping an arm around her friend's shoulders. They took her back to the small room behind the schoolhouse that served as her home. She collapsed onto a small cot, her body racked with sobs. Abigail sat beside her, holding her hand, offering what little comfort she could in the face of such a devastating betrayal. Jack stood in the doorway, his face hard and unreadable. "The truth is a bitter medicine." "Mary Ellen," he said, his voice not unkind, but stripped of any sentiment. "But it is the only cure. We need him to testify." "He is my brother," she wept. "How can I turn against my own blood?" "What he is doing will ruin this whole town," Jack countered. "It will ruin the families of the children you teach. Sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing are the same." He turned and left them, the burden of the decision hanging in the small, dark room. The next evening, they gathered in the main room of the ranch house. A council of war. Abigail, Jack, Ruthie, and a sobered, red-eyed Mary Ellen. They also sent for Dr. Avery, who arrived smelling more of coffee than whiskey for once. Silas has already made his move. Jack began, "I had a man in the county seat. Whitlock has filed a formal motion to have all his outstanding property claims, including yours. Abigail, ratified by a circuit judge. It is a legal trap. He is using the law to wash his dirty laundry, to turn his counterfeit claims into legitimate titles before the railroad meeting." "So we are out of time," Ruthie said, her voice a low growl. "Not yet," said Abigail, Her voice was quiet, but it commanded the room. She had spent the day poring over a set of Jack's freight ledgers. They made up stories. "We have facts." She pointed to a page. "According to Silas's promissory note, my husband took delivery of a wagon load of lumber and supplies on the 10th of last October. But your ledgers show that Snowbridge Pass was closed by a rock slide from the 9th to the 13th. No freight wagon of that size could have gotten through. It is impossible." Jack nodded, a flicker of appreciation in his eyes. "The lie is in the logistics." "And the paper," Dr. Avery added, peering at the burned scrap Abigail had found. "I can test the ink. The ink the county uses has a specific chemical base. I would be willing to wager that the ink on this scrap, and on your seizure writ, Abigail, has a different composition. Something made with soot, perhaps, from a forge." He looked at Ruthie. "We have a plan." "Then," Jack said, taking command, "we use my ledgers to prove their timeline is a lie. We use Dr. Avery's testimony to prove the materials are fraudulent. And we use Jasper Pike to prove who commissioned the fraud." Just then, Mr. Lou entered, carrying a plate of dark, leathery-looking strips of meat. "To aid in your deliberations," he announced gravely. "Beef jerky, my own recipe, guaranteed to clear the head." Jack, preoccupied, took a large piece and bit into it. His eyes immediately widened. He began to cough, a deep, hacking sound, his face turning a startling shade of red as he gasped for air. "Mr." Lou watched him, impassive, too much chili. "Perhaps," he mused. Abigail, seeing the fearsome owner of the three-spur ranch undone by a piece of dried meat, could not help it. A giggle escaped her lips, then another. Soon, she was laughing. A pure, unrestrained sound of mirth that broke the heavy tension in the room. Even Ruthie cracked a smile. Jack, after taking a long swig of water, looked at Abigail, a half-glare, half-smile on his own face. The moment of levity was shattered the next morning by a rider from the south. "The bridge over Cottonwood Creek is gone," he shouted as he galloped into the yard. "A flash flood, a mudslide up the canyon, took the whole thing out." Jack and Abigail exchanged a look. The circuit judge was due to arrive from the south in 2 days. The only other route was a 3-day detour through the mountains. Nature, in its blind, impartial way, had just intervened. "It bought us time," Abigail said, her mind racing. "An extra day, maybe 2. "It is enough," Jack said. He looked at the heavy ledger on his desk, its pages filled with the neat, orderly facts of his business. He took a leather thong and tied it securely around the book, as if binding a sacred text. The Whitlocks had their false seals and their purchased laws. He had his truth, bound in leather and cordage. The simple, unassailable law of honest work. Now, all they had to do was convince a terrified young man to choose his conscience over his fear. The target was no longer a ghost in the mountains. It was Jasper Pike. The washed-out bridge had given them 2 extra days, a gift of mud and churning water. Jack had used them not to rest, but to act. A rider had been dispatched on the long northern route, carrying a carefully worded legal summons. The Whitlocks, believing the circuit judge to be stranded to the south, had pressed ahead, arranging for their own justice to be dispensed by the pliable county attorney in a venue of their choosing. That venue was the town's largest corn warehouse. It was not a courtroom, but a vast, dusty cathedral of commerce, hastily converted for the day. Benches had been brought in from the church and the saloon, and they were packed with the silent, watchful citizens of Cottonwood Gulch. The air was thick with the smell of dry corn, sweat, and a tension so palpable it felt like another layer of dust. Wind found its way through the cracks in the board walls, carrying with it the grit of the plains, making the shafts of light slanting down from the high windows shimmer with dancing motes. At a long trestle table at the front sat the county attorney, a man whose legal opinions were known to be as flexible as the balance in his bank account. To his right sat Silas Whitlock, his face a mask of smug propriety, a stack of documents neatly piled before him. His mother, Martha, sat in the front row, a black-clad statue of righteous indignation. Deputy Ephraim Murdoch stood near the table, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol, a guardian of a law he had helped to write. Silas rose to speak, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. He laid out his case with a practiced, sorrowful air. He spoke of his dear departed brother, of the unfortunate debts left behind, of his family's desire to simply settle affairs with decency and in accordance with the law. He held up the promissory note and the seizure writ, flourishing them for the crowd to see. Deputy Murdoch stepped forward and pointed to the red wax seal on the main document. A legal seal, he announced, authorized by the county. The attorney nodded gravely, preparing to hammer his gavel and bring the farce to its conclusion. It was then that Jack Coulter rose from his seat near the back. He carried a single, heavy object, his freight ledger, bound in thick leather. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Every eye in the room was already on him. I believe there is a matter of evidence that has been overlooked. He placed the ledger on the table before the attorney. He nodded to Abigail, who stood and walked to the front, her movements calm and deliberate. She did not look at the Whitlocks. She addressed the room, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the dusty air. "The document, Mr. Whitlock holds claims that my husband took delivery of a large quantity of lumber and other goods on October 10th of last year. This delivery, according to the weight and volume described, would have required a standard freight wagon." She opened the ledger. "This book," she said, patting the open page, "records every wagon, every pound of freight that moves through this territory for Coulter Holdings. It records the weather, the trail conditions, and the passage of every mule team and independent hauler who pays for water or feed at our way stations." She ran her finger along a line of neat script. "According to these records, which were logged daily by 3 different station masters, a major rock slide closed Snowbridge Pass, the only viable route from the east, from the evening of October 9th until the morning of October 13th. No freight wagon came into this valley during that time. It was an impossibility." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. Silas's face paled slightly. "It is a trick," he sputtered. "A fabrication." "Is it?" asked a new voice. Dr. Avery rose from his bench, holding the charred scrap of paper they had found at the forger's camp. "I have also had the occasion to examine the materials used in these documents. The ink used by the territorial government has a specific iron gall base. The ink used on this practice sheet, and on the seizure writ I examined earlier, contains a high concentration of carbon, specifically soot from a coal-fired forge." Ruthie, the blacksmith, let out a loud snort. "Sounds like messy work." The attorney banged his gavel, his face turning a blotchy red. "This is irregular, these witnesses." "There is one more witness," said Mary Ellen Pike. She stood, her face pale but resolute, and looked toward the back of the warehouse. A young man was pushed forward, stumbling into the aisle. It was her brother, Jasper Pike. He stood trembling, his eyes darting around the room like a cornered animal. "Tell them," Mary Ellen urged, her voice breaking. "Tell them the truth." Jasper looked from his sister's pleading face to the murderous glare of Ephraim Murdoch. He swallowed hard. I did it," he stammered, his voice cracking. "I made the seal. Murdoch paid me. He paid me to copy the county seal. He said it was just for some private papers. I did not know." The confession hung in the air, sucking the remaining oxygen out of the room. The murmuring of the crowd grew louder, angrier. Martha Whitlock leaped to her feet, her composure finally shattering. She pointed a trembling finger at Abigail. "It is her," she shrieked, her voice a raw, ugly sound. "This is all her doing, the harlot. She came to this town with nothing and bewitched my son, and now she has bewitched this one. She seduced a rich man to fight her battles, to ruin a good family's name." All eyes turned to Abigail. The accusation, born of pure, distilled hatred, was meant to shame her, to reduce her to a caricature. But Abigail did not flinch. She stood straight and tall, And when she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it silenced the room. "My freedom," she said, looking directly at the unraveling woman, "is a garment I sewed myself. With my own 2 hands. It is not for sale, and it was not a gift from any man." The simple, profound dignity of her words struck the crowd like a physical blow. The tide of opinion, once a silent, fearful thing, turned. Men who had looked away from her in the street now nodded in respect. The Reverend Miller, who had offered her nothing but platitudes, stood up, his face ashen. I must apologize," he said to the room. "To God, and to you. Mrs. Hollis, I was a coward. My silence was a sin." Just as the county attorney was about to lose all control of the proceedings, the great warehouse doors at the back of the room swung open. A tall, gray-haired man in a dusty but well-cut coat strode in, followed by 2 armed bailiffs. "I am Judge Silas Blackwood of the 3rd Judicial Circuit," he announced, his voice booming with an authority that was real and absolute. "I was delayed by a washed-out bridge, but I received an urgent summons from a Mr. Coulter. It seems my presence here is required after all." The bottom fell out of the Whitlock's world. The county attorney shrank in his chair. Silas Whitlock looked at the door like a trapped rat. Judge Blackwood surveyed the scene, his sharp eyes missing nothing. After a brief, low conversation with Jack, he turned his stern gaze on the Whitlocks. He declared all documents bearing the counterfeit seal to be null and void. He ordered an immediate investigation into the business practices of the Whitlock Mercantile, and issued a warrant for the arrest of Silas Whitlock and Deputy Ephraim Murdoch on charges of fraud and conspiracy. It was too much for Ephraim Murdoch. As the bailiffs approached, his face contorted in a mask of pure panic. In one swift, desperate motion, he drew his pistol and grabbed Jasper Pike, pulling the terrified young man in front of him as a shield. "Stay back," he screamed, his voice raw with fear. The crowd surged backward in terror. Jack moved instantly, stepping in front of Abigail, shielding her with his own body. In that split second of chaos, a dark shape flew through the air. Ruthie, with the practical economy of a master craftsman, had thrown her blacksmith's hammer. It spun end over end and struck Murdoch's gun arm with a sickening thud. His shot went wild, blasting a hole in the roof. He howled in pain, but he did not drop the gun. He was trying to bring it around with his other hand when Abigail, acting on pure instinct and Jack's training, moved. There was a loaded pistol, kept for security, on the table where the ledgers had been. She grabbed it, her hands steady, her mind clear. She did not aim at Murdoch. She aimed higher. She squeezed the trigger, and the gun bucked in her hand. The shot was perfect. The bullet struck the chain of a large oil lantern hanging directly over Murdoch's head. The lantern, its glass shattering, crashed down. It did not hit anyone, but it doused the deputy in a shower of hot, smoking lamp oil. He screamed, dropping his pistol to claw at his eyes, temporarily blinded. It was over. The bailiffs swarmed him. In the confusion, Silas Whitlock slipped out a side door and vanished. Martha Whitlock let out a single, guttural sob and collapsed onto the bench. Her family's honor, the brutal, counterfeit honor she had guarded so jealously, lying in ruins at her feet. The judge's bailiffs took a struggling, oil-soaked Ephraim Murdoch into custody. The crowd began to disperse, talking in hushed, excited tones. A silence fell over the great, dusty room. The wind had died down. Outside, the world was still. The dust motes, which had danced so frantically in the shafts of light, now settled slowly, like a gentle fall of ash, coating the scene of the battle in a soft, gray peace. And the people of Cottonwood Gulch, as they left, looked at Abigail Hollis, and they saw not a widow, not a victim, but the woman who had, against all odds, brought the truth to light. The dust of the confrontation settled, but the silence it left behind was heavier. The collapse of the Whitlock dynasty was not a loud explosion, but a slow, quiet implosion. Silas had vanished. a fugitive from the law he had so brazenly twisted to his own ends. Martha remained, a ghost in her own large house, the curtains drawn, her empire of fear reduced to a prison of shame. Ephraim Murdoch was in the custody of the circuit judge's men, his future a matter of iron bars and legal proceedings. The news that came a week later was the final, decisive blow to the old order. A representative from the railroad syndicate arrived not with contracts and surveyors, but with a formal announcement. In light of the serious allegations of title fraud, the syndicate was postponing its decision on the Cottonwood Gulch spur line. A full and thorough review of all land claims would be conducted. The railroad, it turned out, had no interest in buying lawsuits and bad press. They wanted clean land, and Cottonwood Gulch, they had concluded, was anything but. For some, it was a disaster, the dream of a railroad boom vanishing into the dust. But for most, it was a reprieve, a chance to breathe. The suffocating pressure that had driven the Whitlocks' frantic, predatory acquisition of land was gone. The town had been given the one thing it needed more than a railroad, a chance to heal itself, to redefine itself not by the dictates of a single, greedy family, but by the collective will of its people. The seeds of that new will began to sprout in the most unexpected places. The Reverend Miller, his face etched with a genuine and profound shame, announced the formation of a Widows and Orphans Sustenance Fund, his first act of penance for his long and cowardly silence. He seeded it with his own meager savings, and to his surprise, the collection plate at the next Sunday service was heavier than it had been in years. People gave what they could, $1 here, a few coins there, a recognition that the community was only as strong as its most vulnerable members. Mary Ellen Pike, her heart broken but her spirit intact, channeled her family's shame into a fierce new purpose. She started a night class for adults in the schoolhouse. The subject was not literature or history, but bookkeeping. Using a spare Coulter ledger as her textbook, she taught her neighbors how to read a contract, how to understand an account, how to spot the subtle deceptions in a line of credit. "So we are never cheated again," she told her students, her voice ringing with the conviction of someone who had paid a terrible price for ignorance. And at the Three Spur Ranch, Mr. Lou, in his own inscrutable way, made his contribution. He set up a large stew pot on a permanent fire outside the cookhouse. Every evening, a cauldron of thick, nourishing soup was available to anyone who was hungry. No questions asked. It was, he explained to anyone who inquired, his way of paying a debt to the cold season that had brought them so much trouble. Amid this quiet reconstruction of a town's soul, Abigail and Jack had to define their own future. The unspoken thing that had grown between them in the dark of the smokehouse and the heat of the confrontation was now a fact, as solid and real as the mountains on the horizon. But neither of them was given to easy sentiment or grand pronouncements. Their relationship had been forged in work and mutual respect, and it was in work and respect that they sought to build its next chapter. One evening, as they sat in his office, the day's ledgers closed, Jack spoke, his eyes on the fire. "Not on her. The saddlery needs a proper manager," he said. "Someone to handle the accounts, order the supplies, oversee the quality. It could be a profitable part of the business if it were run right." "It could," she agreed, waiting. "I am offering you the position," he continued, his voice as matter-of-fact as if he were discussing the price of hay. "A formal contract, a percentage of the profits. You would be a partner, not an employee. Your name on the books." It was not a proposal of marriage. It was something far more radical, far more intimate. It was a proposal of equality. He was not offering her the protection of his name. He was offering to put her own name alongside his. He was offering her a stake in the very frontier he was said to own. Her heart, which had been so still, began to beat a little faster. "A partnership," she said, testing the word, "with contracts and ledgers. And a shared risk," he added, finally turning to look at her, "and a shared reward." She met his gaze, and in the quiet of the room, a new world took shape. One built not on romance, but on the solid bedrock of a shared enterprise. "I accept," she said. The next day, their new arrangement was celebrated in a manner befitting the three-spur ranch. Ruthie the blacksmith rode into the yard, a piece of paper in her hand. She presented it to Jack with a great deal of ceremony. "An invoice," she announced, "for services rendered. 1 life-saving hammer throw, expertly delivered. 1 ruined deputy. My fee is 1 new, custom-made saddle." Jack took the paper, a rare, genuine smile touching his lips. He took out a pen and scrawled on the bottom, "Agreed and approved. Payment to be rendered in the form of 1 saddle. To be constructed by the new manager of the Coulter Saddlery." He handed the paper to Abigail. "Your first official contract." A few days later, Abigail rode into town alone. She did not go to the mercantile or the schoolhouse. She went to the large, silent house where Martha Whitlock was living out her self-imposed exile. She knocked, and after a long moment, the door opened a crack. Martha's face was a ruin, her once imperious features sunken and gray. She stared at Abigail with hollow, defeated eyes. "What do you want?" she rasped. "To gloat." Abigail said nothing. She held out a small cloth purse. "There is money in here," she said softly. "For medicine, or whatever else you might need." Martha recoiled as if she had been struck. "I do not need your charity." "It is not charity," Abigail replied. "It is a repayment for the food I ate at your table when I was first married. All debts should be paid." She placed the purse on the porch, along with a small, folded piece of paper. Then she turned and walked away. Martha watched her go, then bent down stiffly and picked up the note. She unfolded it. There were only 6 words, written in Abigail's clear, steady hand. "Everyone has the right to start again." The thaw came in earnest. The last of the snow melted from the high country, and Cottonwood Creek, swollen and brown, began to run clear again. The sound of hammers echoed through the valley, not just from Ruthie's forge, but from homesteads where men were building new fences, their lines straight and true. Unlike the crooked boundaries of the past, in the evenings, light shone from the schoolhouse, where Mary Ellen taught her neighbors how to defend themselves with knowledge. Her brother, Jasper, his youthful arrogance replaced by a quiet shame, had been given a sentence of public service by the circuit judge. He spent his days repairing the very bridge his actions had, in a strange way, helped to save. In her new office, a small, neat room Jack had built for her adjoining the main workshop, Abigail took out a fresh ledger. Its cover was of smooth, unmarked leather, and she had bound the spine herself with a tough, bright red thread. She opened it to the first page and, with a dip of her pen, began the first entry in the new life of the Coulter Saddlery, and in the new life of Abigail Hollis. The sun streamed through her window, warm on her hands. Outside, she could see the ranch's cattle being driven across the sparkling creek, their coats wet and shining. The world felt clean, scoured, full of possibility. The land was healing, and so were its people. But as she wrote, a thought, small and persistent as a pebble in a shoe, remained. Her freedom was real, earned, and now documented in her own hand. But the railroad would eventually return. The world outside of Cottonwood Gulch would one day come knocking again. And she wondered, in the quiet, peaceful moment, what new price her freedom, and the towns, would be asked to pay then. Spring had laid its gentle hand upon the high country, and the air itself felt new. The sagebrush, washed clean by the recent rains, released a sharp, herbal perfume into the evening air. The sky above the crazy mountains was a deep, impossible violet, fading to a soft rose at the horizon where the sun had just set. It was in this quiet, perfect moment that Abigail and Jack rode together, their horses moving at a slow walk, the creak of saddle leather a comfortable, rhythmic counterpoint to the evening stillness. They did not need to speak. In the month since the hearing in the warehouse, a new language had grown between them, one of shared glances, comfortable silences, and the easy proximity of two people who understood the landscape of each other's souls. The three-spur ranch was no longer just his, it was theirs. Not in name, not on a deed, but in the shared work, the shared risks, and the shared vision for its future. She was no longer just a mender of leather. She was the mind behind the entire saddlery operation, her ledgers as clean and precise as Jack's own, her designs for new saddles sought after by ranchers from 3 territories. He was no longer just a solitary owner, he was a partner, a man who had, against all his instincts, opened the gates of his fortress and found that sharing his burdens had not weakened him, but had, in fact, made him stronger. It was Jack who finally broke the silence, his voice laced with a gentle, unaccustomed humor. "The folks in town have a story they like to tell about you." Abigail turned to him, a small smile playing on her lips.
I imagine they have a few.
"This one is my favorite," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he looked at her. "They say a poor widow, banished by her in-laws, found her freedom in the arms of the man who owned half the frontier." The line, once a bold quip at a barn dance, now hung in the soft twilight air between them, imbued with a new weight, a new meaning. It was the legend, the simple romantic story that the world had created for them. Abigail considered it for a moment, her gaze sweeping over the vast, darkening landscape that stretched before them. The land was beautiful, but it was hard. It promised nothing for free. Her freedom had not been found here. She knew. It had been forged. "I did not find my freedom in your arms,
Jack,"
she said softly, her voice clear and sure. "I found it in the work we share. I found it in a clean ledger and a fair wage. I found it in the weight of a tool in my own hand. The freedom you gave me was the freedom to earn my own." He nodded slowly, his expression serious now, the humor gone, replaced by a deep and abiding respect. "That is the only kind of freedom worth having." They rode on, the horses picking their way carefully as the last of the light faded from the sky. The first stars began to appear, cold and bright in the deepening violet. "The railroad will be back," she said. It was not a question. He knew what she meant. The world was getting smaller. The solitude and the wildness of the frontier were finite resources. The railroad would bring progress, but it would also bring a new kind of law, a new kind of power, one that could not be faced down in a corn warehouse. "Let them come," he said, his voice a low rumble of resolve. "When they arrive, we will be standing right here, and we will meet them on our own terms, with clean ledgers and clean hearts." It was a promise, a vow made not before a preacher, but before the silent, watching mountains under a canopy of stars. It was a commitment to the principles that had saved them both honesty, hard work, and the unshakable belief that a person's worth was not determined by their name or their wealth, but by the integrity of their actions. Later that night, in the quiet of the ranch house, the day's work done, Abigail went to her workshop. The room smelled of fresh leather and beeswax, a scent she now associated with peace and purpose. On her workbench, among the knives and awls and stamps, lay a new tool, a fine steel swivel knife used for carving intricate patterns. She had been working on a special project, a custom saddle for Ruthie to pay the invoice for the hammer throw. She picked up the knife, its wooden handle smooth and warm in her hand. Using another tool, she carefully, painstakingly, engraved 3 small letters into the handle. A, H, not for Whitlock, for Hollis, for herself. It was a small act, seen by no one, but it was a declaration, a final, quiet severing of the past and a claiming of her own name, her own identity. She moved from the workshop into the main room. A fire crackled in the great stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Jack was sitting in his usual chair, not reading, just watching the flames. She went to the large oil lamp on the main table, the one that served as the central beacon of the house. For so many months in her small, cold cabin, a lamp like this had been her only defense against a darkness that was filled with fear and uncertainty. The night had been an enemy, a time when her loneliness was most acute, her future most in doubt. She reached out and slowly, deliberately, turned the wick down, The flame shrank, and the room was filled with the soft, intimate glow of the firelight. The darkness that gathered in the corners of the room was no longer menacing. It was a comfort. It was a time for rest, for peace, for the quiet companionship of a shared home. The night was no longer something to be survived. It was something to be welcomed. A week later, the mail rider, a familiar sight on his dust-covered horse, brought a letter bearing an official-looking wax seal from the territorial capital. It was addressed to Mr. Jack Coulter and Miss Abigail Hollis, proprietors, 3 Spur Ranch. Jack slid it open with his pocket knife and read it, his expression unreadable. He then handed it to Abigail. Her eyes scanned the formal, legalistic language, but the meaning was astonishingly clear. It was from the Railroad Syndicate. Due to the recent legal proceedings presided over by Circuit Judge Blackwood, the letter stated, and the subsequent investigation which has revealed an unprecedented local commitment to land title transparency and the swift administration of justice, the syndicate has concluded its review. We now believe that Cottonwood Gulch represents a uniquely stable and legally secure environment for investment and development. Therefore, we are pleased to inform you that we have approved the construction of a new spur line, with a freight and passenger depot to be located at Cottonwood Gulch. Construction to commence in the spring. Abigail read the last paragraph twice. To be sure, the words were real. They had not won in spite of their fight for justice. They had won because of it. Their stand for what was right had not just saved her home and her name. It had made their entire community stronger, more honest, and, in the end, more prosperous. The simple, stubborn morality of a clean ledger had proven to be the most valuable asset in the entire territory. She looked up from the letter and met Jack's eyes across the table. No words were needed. A slow smile spread across his face. The same real, unguarded smile she had seen at the barn dance. He had started as a man who defended his holdings, a loner who had built walls to keep the world out. Now, he was a man who was building a community, a partner who had learned that sharing power did not diminish it, but made it grow. And she, the woman who had arrived with nothing but her skills and a desperate will to survive, was now a pillar of that community. A woman whose name was on the contracts, whose voice was heard in the town's councils, whose future was her own to build. They looked out the window, at the vast, sunlit land stretching out before them. The railroad was coming. The world was coming. But they would be ready for it. They would meet it standing straight, together, their hearts clean, their books balanced, and their future, like the endless Montana sky, wide open. Thank you for listening to our story. We invite you to comment below with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people